Panasonic LUMIX S5. I've owned this camera for about 2 years now, and that's quite a long time in camera years. So as we head to the end of 2022, do I still think that the LUMIX S5 is a good buy? Let's find out. When I first picked up the LUMIX S5, I was looking for a B camera to pair with my Panasonic EVA 1, and the S5 had just recently launched, and it was obviously a lot cheaper and smaller than cameras like the S1H or the Sony A7siii. But at the same time, the S5 still boasted a lot of top tier features. You know, it could shoot 4K 10-bit, 422, it shot in Vlog, had dual ISO capability, it had a decent range of resolutions and frame rates, it had dual SD card slots, and also what looked like an excellent in-body image stabilisation or IBIS system compared to other cameras at the time. So yeah, I ended up picking up the S5, it was probably around September, October 2020, and I wanted a test project to learn how it worked and put it through its paces. So I shot a short film with a London artist called Sam Winston covering his dictionary story art project, and you can see that little film linked here. But basically when I brought back the footage after filming for that, I was just slightly blown away by what this camera was capable of. You know, we shot on a very sunny day in the studio and it was quite contrasty, and the way that the camera handled the highlights and the general dynamic range that it captured was just kind of slightly staggering for what I thought I had bought, and I soon realized that this camera was criminally underrated. But you know, that was not particularly surprising when you think about the context of when it was launched. Around about the same time you had the launch of the Sony A7siii, and I think the S5 was just sort of overshadowed by the colossal marketing hype of that camera. Yeah, the A7siii, it's a great camera, I'm not knocking it, but image-wise, I think the two cameras sit at a very similar level, despite the fact that Sony is more than double the cost of the LUMIX S5. And over the last 6 to 12 months, I've started seeing more and more videos online from people on YouTube singing the praises of the S5, and I think that's because people over the last 2 years have really demonstrated how capable a camera is and how powerful it is, and I think that's sort of cut through some of that initial hype that surrounded a camera like the A7siii. But I think there are probably 5 main reasons why the S5 is still going strong, and I think it comes down to its price, the image quality, the pro video features that it boasts, RAW capabilities, and its overall small footprint or form factor. At the moment, you can pick up a new S5 body for around £1,500–1,600 UK. In US, it's probably around $1,700. You compare that to the cost of the A7siii, which retails over here for around £3,800–4,000. That's mad. You know, you could pick up 2 S5s for the price of an A7siii. You could kit out your S5 with a full shooting package, you know, multiple batteries, a lens, cage, handles, an external monitor recorder, you know, all that stuff that you're gonna need for the A7S anyway. Even the sort of other so-called top tier cameras, you know, like the S1H or the Canon R5, they'll still set you back more than the S5, and I think the great thing about the S5 is that you don't necessarily compromise on those top tier features either. Are you really getting twice the amount of camera with the A7siii? In my opinion, you get a superior autofocus system and a slightly better low light and a few other bits and bobs. But if you're not bothered by autofocus, then it begins to get a bit more difficult justifying that massive jump in price. I've always loved shooting in Vlog. It's what's kept me shooting with Panasonic cameras for so long. Vlog gives you a very strong starting point of image. I find it very rich. I find it contains a lot of dynamic range, and the way that it handles highlights is very pleasing. I've pushed very clean images, but at the same time been able to push a very soft, organic and cinematic look. I've sort of touched on it previously, but I just really want to highlight how good the highlight roll-off is in this camera. I think the first time I used it, I was a bit blown away and surprised about how little of the highlights were clipped. and how soft that transition into what was clipped and what wasn't was. Again, when you bring the image back into post, you've got a lot of latitude, even when you're in the compressed 422 10-bit codec. The image coming out of the S5 is incredibly sharp. I'd say almost to its detriment. It's too sharp. And I wouldn't say it's sharp in a sort of over-processed way. I just say it's sort of an inherent sharpness to the image. It's detailed. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it maybe is the sort of quality to this image that sort of makes it look a little bit more digital than a camera like the S1H or the EVA or the Red Komodo. And that's generally because the S5 lacks something called an optical low-pass filter. That filter basically just sort of filters out some of the harshness of an image. It takes away some of the high frequency information, and is generally why people describe footage coming from cameras with those filters like the S1H as being more organic or softer or cinematic, because it just sort of lacks that sort of harsh digital pristine sharpness, which is not something we always associate with cinematic images. But you know what, starting with a really sharp image isn't the end of the world. It's very easy to mitigate, either in camera or in post, or a combination of the two. What I like to do is I like to shoot with vintage glass, old M42 lenses like the Super Takuma 50mm, or with my Desio film Vested Cine Primes. If I'm shooting with modern lenses, or I want to soften the image up even more in camera, then I'll also combine it with something like a black Pro Mist filter. Now, I'd rather start with an image that was too sharp and add filtration and processing in post. It's easier to start with the information and take it away. You can't really add that information in post. One of the downsides of the LUMIX S5 is that if you want to shoot in higher frame rates in 4K, then you have to crop in on the sensor. But because the image is so detailed and sharp, there isn't a noticeable degradation in quality. I tend to shoot all the high frame rate stuff, all the 50 frame stuff that I shoot in HD, and then upscale it to 4K. I find that the HD image, the 1080 image, is so good out of this camera when shooting in 10-bit 422 that it easily intercuts with 25p 4K footage. You just don't notice it. It is such a clean, detailed image, even at 1080, that post-processing it up to 4K is not necessarily noticeable to the eye to most viewers in most situations. So most of the test footage I've shot on this camera that sits on my YouTube or my Vimeo is all upscaled to 4K from 1080, and it looks great in my opinion. Because it has such a clean image, when I shoot on a 2-camera shoot with my EVA 1, what I tend to do is stick the EVA on the close-up tight shot when I'm shooting interviews, and then I stick the S5 on the wide, and because it's so sharp and detailed when I'm shooting in 4K, I can very easily punch into that image and get a third shot almost out of it, or do slow digital zooms in post. Obviously the A7S gets a lot of hype and a lot of praise around its low light performance, and justifiably so, but the S5 is a low light camera. It has a dual ISO setting, so 2 native ISOs where you'll get the best performance. You'll have a low gain setting at 640 ISO and a high gain setting at 4000 ISO when you want to shoot in low light. Now, what's sort of going on there is basically there are what you might call 2 processing circuits on this camera. So at the higher ISO, there's probably more onboard noise reduction being applied and other processing that provides a very clean image. But at the 640 ISO, it's probably protecting and giving you a little bit more dynamic range because there's less noise to handle and less sensor gain being applied. Where possible, I tend to just shoot at 640 or 4000. If you drop down from 4000 to 3200, the next setting underneath 4000, sort of counterintuitively, you'll get a much grainier, noisier image. And that's because you're operating at the lower gain native ISO. So what happens when you're at 3200 is that you're pushing the 640 ISO to its max, and then when you jump up to 4000, the new circuit kicks in, the new set of image processing kicks in, and you get a much cleaner image. So if you are shooting in low light, put it into 4000 to get the maximum benefit and the cleanest image, and you should find that ISOs, slightly above 4000 should also provide you with quite a clean image. We've mostly focused on the video features of this camera, but I need to mention also that it is a very capable stills camera. The images that this camera can produce are detailed. It's a 24 megapixel sensor, so it's more than enough for web work and social media. It's also enough for most printing conditions, small scale printing. I printed a number of my stills from this camera and they look stunning. It's just a really brilliant all-round hybrid camera. So one of the other main things that makes this camera really attractive is its pro video features. You know, it has a slew of great monitoring features, such as monitoring LUTs. I've never seen that in a camera at this price point before. So you can monitor both the log and the Rec. 709 image. You've got waveforms, histograms, zebras, focus peaking, punch into zoom. And you've also got some really excellent anamorphic features, which again is kind of crazy at this price point. Especially to the fact now that you can get L mounts, native anamorphic lenses, budget anamorphic lenses from the likes of Sony. A great selection of resolutions. You can shoot in cinema 4K or standard 4K 1080. It's got everything that I've ever needed to shoot a short film on. The stabilisation in the LUMIX S5 is just what I would probably describe as industry leading. You know, whereas you've got industry leading autofocus in other cameras, the trump card in the S5 is its IBIS. I use a lot of vintage lenses and cinema lenses, so these aren't stabilised lenses. You know, when you're shooting on a heavier cine camera, the weight of that camera kind of acts as your stabilisation, and that's why you don't really see IBIS in more expensive cine cameras. But with the S5 and its stabilisation, it produces footage that is comparable to when I'm shooting on a much heavier camera. It's very floaty and organic and natural. There's none of that sort of artifacting that you find. And what's also really pleasant in this camera is that there's a lot of control and settings around the amount of stabilisation that can be applied. Along with the sensor stabilisation, there's a lot of sort of additional electronic and digital stabilisation options. There's some really cool settings where if you really need it, you can almost get a tripod quality level of stabilization using a combination of the sensor stabilization and the digital stabilization. When I'm using my prime lenses, I dial in the focal length, which tells the camera what level of stabilization to apply that is appropriate to that focal length. But it works so well that you can shoot handheld with macro lenses. You know, I've shot eyes with a macro lens handheld using just the stabilization in this camera. It really is very good. It's excellent. If you pair it up with an external recorder like the Atomos Ninja or the Blackmagic Video Assist, then you unlock its RAW recording capability. And not only that, you can choose between ProRes RAW or Blackmagic RAW. And again, it's something that's kind of astonishing at the price point of this camera, but whichever one of those you work with, you get 6K RAW with this camera. So the sensor is a 6K sensor. So by shooting in RAW, you get the raw unprocessed image out of that. There are some limitations in that at 6K, you're limited to 30 frames a second, you can't go beyond that. But if you knock it down to 4K recording, then you do unlock 50 and 60 frames per second. I think having this RAW capability in a camera of this size and price point is just, quite frankly, phenomenal. And I think, in my opinion, the fact that you can get all of this for less than the price of the body of a Sony A7siii makes it really difficult to justify spending that much on a camera like that, considering what you get with the LUMIX S5. It's a very small camera, and that's what attracted me to it first. I was looking for a B camera after all. I was looking for something that wouldn't add too much weight to my camera bag when I was bringing two cameras along on a shoot. You know, the S5 weighs in at just over 700 grams. I'm fairly certain that the S1H and the A7S Mark III both come in at over a kilogram. And those I know who shoot with the A7S Mark III and the S1H, those are heavy cameras and they take their toll. And you know, holding DSLRs isn't easy when you're shooting for a whole day, but it's definitely manageable with the lighter weight of the S5. Also find, because it is such a smaller camera, then I just take it out with me a lot more in terms of my spare time. It's really nice to use as a stills camera. The S5 is just a very sort of grab and go camera. You know, it packs down into a tiny camera backpack, and it still allows me to bring, you know, two lenses, a monitor, and audio equipment, and then just a small tripod. It's a really like simple setup, but can provide very professional looking and cinematic results. Okay, so We've been sort of hyping up the S5 for most of this video, but obviously no camera is created perfect, and I think we need to sort of spend a bit of time in this video looking at some of the quirks and downsides and negatives of this camera. Everyone slates the Panasonic autofocus, and fair enough. You know, it doesn't compare to the titans of Sony and Canon, but for a lot of needs it's actually adequate. It's not awful, it generally does work in a lot of situations. You know, I use the S5 as my vlogging camera, and I've never really had any problems. I've never encountered any problems. You know, set my camera up, sit down, set it on face track, and you know, within a few seconds it's locked onto my face, and it tends to lock onto my face for the duration of recording these vlogs. So for my needs in sort of non-challenging environments, it does work. I've also tested the autofocus in the field shooting moving subjects. I found if you stick the camera in 4K 50 frames or 60 frames, then the autofocus does work pretty well. It's able to track people, it doesn't hunt too much. When you drop the frame rate down to 25, that's when it become a bit glitchy and does hunt a bit more. In stills mode, again, it's responsive, it works. But if you're trying to shoot something that is side lit or backlit, it does tend to hunt and struggle, and it's easier and quicker just to hit manual focus, which is quite frustrating, I'll admit. If you absolutely must have reliable, industry-leading autofocus, fine, this isn't going to be for you. Another annoying feature for some people might be the fact that when you shoot at 4K in 50 or 60 frames per second, you have to crop in on the sensor. It's also in a slightly more compressed codec. It's in HEVC, which is technically still 10-bit, but it's 420. So I think for a lot of people, having to crop in at that rate might be a bit of a deal breaker. I think it can go up to 180 frames a second. By that point though, you're so cropped in on the sensor, you're down to about 8-bit in terms of recording quality. The footage just looks very noisy and mushy, but if you're shooting professional footage, it's not going to cut in very well with the stuff you shot in 25 or 50 frames a second. I've never needed to shoot in anything more than 60 frames a second. For that one shoot a year where you might need higher frame rates, just rent a Sony A7S3 or whatever camera that can achieve that high frame rate. Another negative is the micro-HDMI port on the camera. Micro-HDMI is less secure than a sort of standard HDMI, but I've never knocked the cable out. I've shot a lot of handheld. I shoot with an external monitor 90% of the time, and I've never had any problems. I think if you're recording externally, it might be more of a concern, but there are plenty of accessories that you can buy to help pin or lock that cable in. But I completely understand for some people who are used to working with a more professional setup that the micro HDMI might be a bit of a weak link in the production chain. For what this camera can achieve and for its size and price point, it's a compromise I'm willing to make. I only have 2 of the official Panasonic batteries with this S5. I found that they'll mostly get me through a day. I find one battery will give me around 2 to 3 hours of recording on and off. The other amazing trump card that this camera has, and the reason why I've probably not bought any more batteries, is that you can power this camera via a USB-C wire and, you know, a cheap portable power bank. So often if the camera's sitting on a tripod and I've got a long day shoot, I will just keep the power bank plugged into the camera so we're not draining batteries. It's such a great little feature and potentially could really save you from some tricky situations if you lose or forget a battery. So I don't really want to get into those silly debates about one camera being the best or better than the other, because I don't think it really comes down to that anymore. I think most modern cameras are all comparable in terms of their image quality. You know, like for like, if you're shooting in decent environments, a camera like the S5 is going to give you very similar results to a camera that is twice the price like the A7S3. What it comes down to now is features. You know, do you want to pay more and have better autofocus, higher frame rates, or are you happy having a camera without those features with just as good image quality? For me, the Panasonic S5 is an incredible camera. It is more than capable of delivering cinematic, professional grade images. Considering its price point, I don't think you're getting more camera if you stump up for the Sony A7siii. I think you're paying for a Sony brand, I think you're paying for autofocus, and I think you're paying for frame rates. For the vast majority of people, those are not features that you necessarily need, and I think that money that you could be spending on an A7S could be better spent on kitting out your Lumix S5, buying lenses, monitors, recorders, and the likes. You know, whether you're an amateur, whether you're just starting out, or whether you're a professional filmmaker and you're looking to purchase your first camera or upgrade your camera, and you're looking to limit the amount that you spend or maximize the amount you get for your money, I think the S5 is probably the most obvious choice when I look at what's available out there and the various price points of the different cameras. The images from the S5 are stunning. Whether you shoot in Vlog or in one of the camera picture profiles, it's a very capable camera, and I think it's very future-proof as well. The fact that it can shoot RAW for the cost of an external recorder means that I think this camera will last for 3 to 4 years into the future. You know, it's also a pretty sensible investment, right? If you're charging your clients for kits, for the camera you bring along to the shoot, you're going to pay the S5 off a lot quicker. It's going to take you twice as long to pay a camera off like the Sony A7S Mark III, which means that once you've paid the S5 off, every time you charge that camera out after that, you're going to be making money off that camera. So it makes good sense investment-wise as well. You know, I'm not a Panasonic fanboy as well. I'm not being paid by Panasonic to say this. I recently bought a red Komodo, and the S5 is still a camera I use regularly despite owning that, you know, much more capable camera. I'm not selling it anytime soon. I'm still using it, you know, on a monthly, if not weekly basis. So if you are interested in buying this camera, I pulled together a playlist which includes all the videos that I've shot over the years that feature the S5, so you can take a look at that and see what it's capable of. If you do want to buy the camera, I have some affiliate links down below. It doesn't cost you anything extra, but it does give me a small commission and helps me support this channel. I do it all in my spare time and I work full time. I'm currently recording this on a Sunday evening. Anything you can do to help support this channel, whether it's subscribing, liking these videos, I would really appreciate it. Thank you. I've also set up a PayPal link. If you felt like sending me a couple of quid or buying me a pint or a cup of coffee, then feel free to donate whatever you can afford there. I would really appreciate it. I don't expect you to give me lots of money, but more as a morale booster. It would really make a difference. If you can't, that's cool, don't worry. Just subscribe to the channel and give this video a thumbs up. That would be more than enough. I'd really appreciate it. So until next time, see ya.